President Reagan and his foreign policy team were thrown off guard by King Hussein's caustic remarks to the New York Times. Just before the interview, President Reagan appealed to American Jews to support arms sales to Jordan. Administration officials considered that a politically courageous move in this election year and were stunned by what they saw as Hussein's lack of gratitude.
There are certainly aspects of the King's remarks with which we disagree, and clearly we disagree with the suggestion that the United States is unprincipled.
The King's public rebuff of U.S. proposals in the Middle East angered many in Congress, where support for the sale of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Jordan seems to be fast eroding. We'll be talking with King Hussein later in the broadcast. With us now from New York is former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, thanks for being with us this morning.
Glad to be here.
King Hussein seems to have stunned and embarrassed the Ronald Reagan White House by his remarks to the New York Times. Why do you think he chose such a public forum to openly criticize the administration at this point in time?
I think the King is in an extremely difficult position because for him, entering the negotiations, whatever the ultimate outcome, will expose him to pressures from all the radical Arab states in the area. So while I thought that some of his remarks were perhaps unnecessarily harsh, he wanted to dissociate himself, in my view, before he became exposed through a lot of publicity to the charge that he might enter negotiations in which he really had no confidence and require a protection in which I'm afraid he no longer believes.
Well, what does this say about the status of the United States in the Middle East and therefore, I suppose, around the world?
Well, I think with the withdrawal of American forces from Beirut, however explicable it is, it will force everybody in the area to reassess their position. I think the radicals now believe that they have achieved a victory, but as the Lebanese situation evolves, they will undoubtedly, the Syrians will undoubtedly find that the complexities of Lebanon are not peculiar to Americans, but they will face them as well. The Israelis will have to, they're not obviously radicals, but the Israelis will have to reassess their position, and all the other states, being brought face to face with reality, will have to find a new pattern. As far as the United States is concerned, I think it is absolutely imperative that we do nothing until we are sure we can succeed with it. And therefore, I believe a pause in diplomatic effort while everybody reassesses the situation would be highly desirable.
Well, that does seem to be what the administration is doing. We're told they have no new initiatives. We're told our mediators have all left the area. And you agree with what they're doing, then absolutely nothing?
Well, absolutely nothing. I think we should do an internal study of where we want to go. I think we ought to have private discussions with some of the parties. I do not believe that we should re-enter the diplomatic arena until we are sure that we can succeed in what we are proposing, because otherwise the decline in our credibility will lead to a situation where areas that are not directly affected by the Arab-Israeli conflict, such as in the Persian Gulf, where their willingness to resist the pressures that are building up there is going to be affected.
Now, what about King Hussein's central criticism that we are so one-sidedly pro-Israel, that we have lost our credibility in the region? Do you think we should come out and publicly pressure Israel more than we have to stop the settlements?
I don't think there's any point in the United States taking any abstract theoretical position for or against anybody until we can relate it to a concrete negotiating program and some foreseeable outcome. In the past, our friendship for Israel could be used as an advantage. In the past, it was possible to tell the moderate Arab states, at least, and indeed even Syria, that we alone were in a position to bring about Israeli concessions, not necessarily by pressure, but by the fact that Israel would take us more seriously than anybody else. So I don't take that argument as his real argument. I think his real concern is the decline in the American ability to influence events as shown by Lebanon, and his fear that if he agreed to enter negotiation, he would become the target of all the frustrations of the radical Arab world at a time when Syria has achieved a considerable prestige due to Lebanon.
Now, if the United States does nothing, isn't there a possibility that the Soviet Union will move in, say, to a vacuum? And isn't that really what our whole policy has been all about for the past more than 10 years, to keep the Soviets out of the region?
Well, but doing nothing is better than failing, and I'm not saying we should do nothing forever. If the Soviet Union moves actively into the area, it will face the same problem that I've just described for the United States in even more acute form. The Soviet Union has no diplomatic capacity to bring about any solution. And if it encourages a military conflict, it has to calculate that its surrogates there are going to be, or its friends there, are going to be, in all likelihood, militarily not as strong as Israel, with which we have friendly relations. So for the Soviet Union to run a high-risk course in the Middle East would be a rather reckless adventure. And I don't say we should do nothing. I say we should assess the situation, we should design a strategy, we should try to reestablish a belief in our ability to affect events. And I don't think we should re-enter negotiations until we have an agreement in principle with the parties, not on the precise outcome, but on the outlines of what we are trying to do.
This sounds like a policy that suits Ronald Reagan's campaign plans, to sort of forget the Middle East till after the election. Makes sense to you?
It may suit President Reagan's campaign plans, but it above all suits the national interest. I think to call for negotiations in the abstract, when the two sides have totally different views as to what the outcome should be, is bound to lead to a stalemate, and that is against our national interest.
What happens if Congress rejects the sale of arms to Jordan? Is that another disaster for American policy or not?
Well, I would suspect that Hussein will start buying Soviet arms, or start playing with the purchase of Soviet arms. But I frankly would prefer it if the whole situation were assessed in an integrated way before we make any final decisions. But my suspicion would be that Hussein will buy Soviet arms.
Now, what about Assad? You spent many, many hours negotiating with him. What is his motivation? Is he just trying to...
You know, I have high regard for Assad. He is a tough Syrian nationalist. He is using the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is using him. But I do not believe that he is a Soviet surrogate. He is actually an extremely interesting man to talk to, but he's a cold-blooded, brutal calculator. And he has assessed the situation in Lebanon more or less to his benefit and correctly. His ambition is to to be the leader of Arab nationalism and to have no settlement occur in which he does not participate.
We are fast running out of time. Do you think the situation for the United States is salvageable, or?
I think it is salvageable, but it requires enormous discipline. It requires that we think through where we are going to go, and that we do not engage in ad hoc pieces that try to fix an immediate situation. We need some long-range plan.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger, for being with us this morning. And we will be back with an interview with Jordan's King Hussein.
Don't move me, please.
With us now, Henry Kissinger, who is National Security Advisor to President Nixon, negotiated a settlement of the war with the North Vietnamese. Dr. Kissinger, both you and Richard Nixon are now saying that we really didn't lose the war, we won the war, but we lost the peace. And you're blaming Congress, you're blaming Kennedy and Johnson, you're blaming the press. Aren't you and Richard Nixon responsible at all for the disaster in Vietnam?
First of all, before I answer your question, I'd like to make a comment about what was in the introduction, in which a statement of mine, Pieces at Hand, was taken as an example of misrepresentation. That statement was made on October 30th. The breakthrough in the negotiations occurred on January 8th, and the peace agreement was signed on January 23rd. In other words, 8 weeks later. I don't consider that such a severe misstatement, and it's an example of the systematic distortion that's been going on about what went on in Vietnam. Now, secondly,
let me just
I
interrupt for
didn't
1
blame
second.
Kennedy and Johnson. I said mistakes were made in every administration, including the Nixon administration. There were mistakes in the Kennedy administration, there were mistakes in the Johnson administration, and there were mistakes in the Nixon administration. I think, however, that the fundamental commitment was valid, and that the fundamental cause of the collapse of South Vietnam was to be found in the divisions in our country and the ruthlessness in which the domestic debate was pursued.
Well, would you concede that one of the mistakes was that in the peace treaty that you did sign, you left the North Vietnamese army in place? And I'm wondering how you can say you won the war if you agree.
No, Mr. Nixon said we won the war.
You don't agree with that?
I said we achieved an honorable peace. That's different from saying we won the war. Now, in the agreement, in leaving the North Vietnamese army in place, first of all, one has to look at the state of our public opinion. The Congress had already passed non-binding resolutions, which were certainly going to be made binding, for a unilateral withdrawal of American forces. We had been offering for 3 years a ceasefire in place. Finally, the specific provisions of the agreement were that the North Vietnamese army that was in South Vietnam could stay in place, that it could not be reinforced, that no additional supplies could be sent there. We thought that it would, under those conditions, if they maintained the agreement, it would wither. In Laos, they agreed to withdraw their army and didn't withdraw it. In South Vietnam, they agreed not to reinforce their forces and reinforced them. And in both cases, the agreement collapsed because we were deprived of the means of enforcing it. That is the problem.
So let's get back to your contention then. You do say, let me ask you, do you say that Congress is the reason that Vietnam collapsed?
There isn't any one reason. There are many reasons. I think originally the administrations, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, took on a task that was greater than they estimated. I think Nixon, as I've stated publicly, made the mistake of carrying on his shoulders alone a war which had become so contentious and not making the Congress an adequate partner. I think that our domestic divisions had reached a point, however, so that from the 70s on, I place a heavy responsibility on Congress and on the recklessness with which the critics used every weakness in an ambiguous position to undermine the credibility of their government. We would never have been able to fight World War II if there had been a systematic assault on the administrations then in office. That is my point. I'm not saying that the administrations made no mistakes.
Okay, one of the problems everybody says is that, and you I think say this too, that it's virtually impossible to fight a war when public opinion is against you. Do you and Richard Nixon not take any responsibility for making the war even more unpopular by concealing such things as the bombing of Cambodia?
But you know, there are certain slogans where it's like ringing a bell and the horse goes to the water. The bombing of Cambodia. What happened in the bombing of Cambodia? The North Vietnamese had 4 divisions in Cambodia in which they were killing Americans, 3 weeks after President Nixon came into office, they started an offensive in South Vietnam, in part from these Cambodian bases, in which 500 Americans were killed each week. President Johnson had made a bombing halt of North Vietnam, which President Nixon was reluctant to break. So he bombed not Cambodia, he bombed the North Vietnamese concentrations at the border of Cambodia to a distance of about 3 to 5 miles. Our original expectation was that there would be a protest, that we would then ask for a UN investigation that would reveal the presence of these forces. Then the government of Cambodia didn't protest. And this put us into the crazy situation that that the government didn't protest. We didn't want to announce it because we were doing damage to the North Vietnamese. And we were trying to save American lives. We briefed the congressional committees that were dealing with covert operations, and we dealt with it as a covert operation. But to say concealing bombing of Cambodia, that's one of those myths that has been foisted upon the public, which is a disgrace.
Okay, let me try to bring this up to the present and get at what happened in Vietnam and what it means for what's happening in Central America today. The charges had been made then that there were things being done that the public wasn't fully being informed about. Your explanation wasn't made at the time. There were statements and exaggerations being made. There are critics who say that that's what's going on right now with the Reagan administration, that they're exaggerating the threat in Nicaragua, and that every now and then secret documents are revealed. For example, a recent one saying that the real aim is to expand the number of Contras fighting the Nicaraguan government. Are you warning this administration, or do you feel that you should, that the misleading statements are only making the unpopularity of the Reagan administration worse? Do you feel that that was a big mistake of yours and Reagan?
First of all, I have a basic principle that I don't volunteer advice to the administration unless they ask me for it, and they haven't asked my opinion.
Would you like to warn them about that?
First of all, you'd say misleading statements. Some things that journalists call misleading statements reflect honest confusion. Some things that they call misleading are honest differences of opinion. The fundamental problem in Central America is whether a communist Nicaragua is a threat to our vital interest 500 miles from our borders. And the thing that I would warn the American people about is that we are in danger of repeating the same sort of debate that took place on Vietnam, in which critics use every stick they can find to beat the administration over the head. The administration then, in order to protect what it considers to be the vital American interest, presents only its best case. Then some document is found among the thousands of documents that float around that is used to undermine the administration's position. The fundamental issue we have to decide is whether a communist Nicaragua with up to 10,000 foreign advisors represents a threat to our security.
All right, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, who'll be on this broadcast in about 2 minutes, has come back with some concessions from the Sandinistas. They say they'll have a ceasefire, they say they'll restore civil liberties, they say they'll get rid of the Soviet and Cuban military advisors if the United States stops giving aid to the Contras and if we resume our peace talks with them. Do you think the Reagan administration should go along or just dismiss this out of hand?
Well, with all due respect to Congressman Kerry, he's a congressman, he's not Secretary of State, and if the Nicaraguans want to make an offer, they ought to make it in diplomatic channels. We can't be negotiating with our own congressmen and the Nicaraguans simultaneously. My own view is that what we want from the Nicaraguans is the removal of foreign military and intelligence advisors.
They've agreed to that, apparently.
Wait a minute. A reduction of armed forces, a low ceiling on the introduction of foreign advisors, and the participation of all groups, including what are now called the Contras, in the political process. If these objectives are achieved, then obviously there is no need for a guerrilla war, and then serious negotiations can take place. I cannot judge whether Congressman Kerry's proposals meet those conditions or not, because a lot depends on the fine print. If those conditions are met that I've outlined, I think then we have a basis for negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Henry Kissinger. And we'll be back with Senator Kerry and Congressman McCain in a minute. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has had phone conversations with the president about the Iran situation. We asked him earlier if he thought the president should apologize to the American people.
Any president is entitled to make a mistake, and I don't see why an apology is called for. And I would think that what needs to be done now is to get the facts out to prevent a repetition of that occurrence, which resulted from bad procedures and some appalling advice, and to fix that. And at some appropriate moment, the president might say what he's done to fix it. But I don't see that a breastfeeding is indicated.
Let me ask you about a Barbara Walters report on ABC the other night. She said that when McFarlane went to Tehran, the Iranians urged him to accept the release of 2 hostages right then and there, and then wait a while and 2 more would be released. But that Mr. McFarlane said, I want all 4 American hostages out right now or no deal at all. Do you think he made a mistake in not accepting the 2 hostages right then and there?
Well, it's awfully hard to second-guess a tactical decision made by somebody on the ground who knew all of the decisions. I am fundamentally opposed to any negotiation about hostages. The minute you begin a negotiation about hostages, you create 2 situations. One, you set yourself up for precisely this sort of retail business that happened in Tehran, where you ask for 4, you get 2, and then when you accept 2, maybe they give you only 1. You get into the undignified and outrageous retail business like this. And secondly, at any one moment, there are tens of thousands of Americans all over the world, and they can always replenish their stock of hostages. And the fundamental mistake was to have any negotiation about hostages at all, and equally to have to bring it in the context of arms. So was that a mistake? Oh, I suppose having gone this far, they should have accepted 2. But I have no strong conviction on that subject.
You know, somebody told us at CBS News that all the documents and computer disks that the congressional committees are reviewing show absolutely no discussion of options, costs of failure, what to do if this becomes public and is disclosed.
It's, from this point of view, from the point of view of procedure, I do not understand why nobody went to the president and said to him, Mr. President, you cannot do this. The risks are totally out of proportion to anything you can gain. I don't know whether if the president might have thought this was a normal policy discussion in which he could overrule some people without consequence, like the numbers on arms control negotiations. But somebody should have gone to the president and said, now, Mr. President, this is so risky, this is so contrary to everything you've ever said, that here are the 10 consequences that are going to flow from it. And I just, from my limited knowledge of the president, I don't think he's a big gambler.
Well, let me ask you specifically about the Middle East. We now know that we gave intelligence data to both Iran and Iraq, possibly even disinformation. We're not sure about that, but possibly. We seem to be developing strains with Israel over whether they initiated this whole Iran arms business or not. How do we begin to repair and reestablish our foreign policy in the Middle East?
I think to give intelligence data to both sides in a war is a big mistake. I think that's a sort of Machiavellianism that loses you credit all over. And when I read this memorandum to the president that was published and released by the White House, here the Security Council staff is saying Iraq is winning the war against Iran. Well, they must be the only people in the world who are believing this. And when you are giving the president wrong factual information, you're likely to get a wrong decision.
Why don't you, and why doesn't anybody else, just blame the president? It's his presidency, it's his White House.
Well, I think he is, in a way, to blame for the organization that was set up. He had the misfortune that for 6 years everything went so well that the weaknesses of the organization didn't become apparent, and so he had to pay a big price when it suddenly did become apparent. But I think one has to understand that the weaknesses that showed up were the reverse side of great strengths, and now these weaknesses have to be fixed. I don't, in my heart, blame the president as much as I do most of his associates.
Why not? It's his presidency. It's
certainly,
his responsibility.
in an ultimate sense, he's of course responsible. But in an ultimate sense, we are also not in a bad foreign policy. We're in a good foreign policy position with one big mistake having been made. If he doesn't fix it, If he continues operating the way he has, then I would blame him, but I have every hope that he doesn't.
Henry Kissinger. We'll be right back. Joining us now from Connecticut, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and in Los Angeles, former Deputy Secretary of State in the Carter administration, Warren Christopher. Let's go to Los Angeles first. And Warren Christopher, you were very deeply involved in the Carter administration's attempts to get the American hostages out in 1980. I want to ask you about these recent rumors. Is it possible in your mind that third parties, without any authorization from the Reagan administration, are trying to make deals with Iran? Or do you think the administration is in some way involved?
Well, Leslie, this is no business for amateurs or freelancers, but it seems to have a fascination for them. In 1980, we had a constant stream of private individuals coming to the State Department telling us that they knew how to solve the hostage crisis. We refused to have them go forward, but as I say, it has a fascination for them. Right now, I think the United States has a particular problem. One of the sad legacies of the Iran-Contra scandal is that the world may believe that we use private parties as General Secord was used. So I think we have to emphasize strongly that this is a government business, and I'm glad that Secretary Shultz did that last week.
Well, Henry Kissinger, do you read it as freelancers, or do you think that the administration is somehow orchestrating some kind of negotiation behind the scenes through these third parties?
I think it's possible that they're freelancers running loose, because I agree with Warren Christopher that it exercises a weird fascination on outsiders. I think fundamentally that the Iranian position is such that they will be releasing the hostages sometime over the next 6 months, and that they're debating in Tehran right now whether to release some of them for this administration or some of them for the newly elected administration. It doesn't require a very complicated negotiation. It seems to me, I think it would be a terrible mistake to negotiate even on part of the government, because we should not pay for hostages, since that only encourages the taking of more hostages. I think Iran has recognized that they have to open up to some Western nations, that they cannot do that while they hold these hostages, and that is our basic asset. And it requires no intermediary, and from the government it requires only a message that the hostages are an obstacle to any normalization.
Well, we've done that already. It's my understanding that we have sent many messages saying that we'd like to negotiate government to government or deal government to government, signals that we'd like to improve relations. We've done all of that and nothing's happened. How do you know?
Well, plenty has happened in Iran, not necessarily with respect to the United States. They've stopped the war with Iraq. They have improved relations with France. They have solved analogous problems with Britain. They have obviously divisions within their own country, and those have to be managed by their own domestic processes. When they took the hostages, both in the Carter administration and in the earlier part of the Reagan administration, their strategy was to humiliate the United States. And the more we negotiated, the more they made us look as if they could impose their will on us and demonstrate the impotence of the United States to protect its citizens and hence the people in the area. That condition has now changed. I think over the next 3 to 4 years, they will be looking to Western nations as a safety net, and it isn't in their interest to humiliate us, but it will go by fits and starts. And of course it will require some official statements and negotiations on our part to make clear that we are receptive to an improvement in relations, but I would pay nothing for the hostages.
Warren Christopher, do you think that it's a good move, as I gather we've already made, to seek to improve relations while the hostages are still being held?
Well, let me say this, Leslie, I wouldn't run after the Iranians. I don't have very many illusions about the present administration regime in Iran. The Ayatollah has such a strong anti-U.S. position. He's so unreliable, so untrustworthy, that frankly I'm quite skeptical about that. I think we may have to wait for a new regime. One thing I would say about Iran is that They have a great love to try to manipulate our elections. I saw that in 1980 and 1981, and they've shown that around the world, as in the French election. So I think the United States needs to be very skeptical, very wary of moves that Iran may try to make during this sensitive period. They like to play games in our elections, and we ought to be on the lookout for steps that they might take to mislead us or to get up our hopes in a false kind of way.
Well, you suggest...
I'm not in favor of running after Iran. I'm, in fact, opposed to talking about the hostages at all. I think the only message that Iran needs from us is that the hostages are an obstacle to an improvement of relations, and then see what they will do.
Well, what do you make of these messages that, that our government has sent, that we are willing to deal government to government, willing to talk government to government, a message sent while the hostages are still being held?
I have no objection to that at all, provided it is made clear that the actual dealing will not take place until the hostages are released. The only way to deal with hostages is to devalue them. That is to say, you cannot get anything for them.
Well, wait a minute. We've sent a message saying we'd like to have talks, government to government, the message sent while the hostages are still being held. That's where we stand right now, as I understand it.
I would be, the only conversation that I think it is worth having with the Iranians is to say that we have no national interest in keeping them down, that we are not opposed to them, that their independence is an American interest, but no concrete implementation of that conviction can be discussed until the hostages are released.
Okay.
And beyond that, I wouldn't go.
Warren Christopher, can I get back on the question of why there seems to be flurries of activities around elections? You suggest that it may be Iran trying to manipulate our political process, but what about what the various administrations do to encourage that or maybe even instigate it? All the stories during the '80 campaign, when you were involved, suggested that the Carter administration itself was taking kind of strenuous efforts to get the hostages home as the election was underway. And as you know, President Carter, was making optimistic assessments of the situation before every primary.
Leslie, our policy was no mystery in 1979 and 80 and 81. We wanted the hostages back the day after they were taken. We worked strenuously for that. So there's no mystery about what we wanted. We wanted them back any day we could get them back.
But didn't the activity heat up around the election? It certainly, as I recall, certainly did.
Well, I met with an Iranian in Germany on the 15th and 17th of September of 1980, but that was something that they initiated. Maybe they were manipulating us at that point, but we were ready any day to talk with them, and we finally got that opportunity in September. Of course, nothing happened until January.
Well, but did you not feel any special heat from the White House, the political side of the White House, to try and get this done before the election?
I didn't have to have any heat from any place. I had selected some of the people who went to Iran, and I almost became obsessed with getting them back, so nobody had to tell me to try harder. Well,
Dr. Kissinger, the last time a hostage was released, it was 1986, right before the congressional elections, right, when an American hostage was released, and we know that this administration was working overtime at that point. Why do you think it happens around elections?
Oh, I suppose that administrations welcome some good news just before elections. Speaking as an outsider and maybe as a professor, what I would really like to see is that when there are hostages, is that about 6 weeks before the election, we tell the hostage takers, we don't want to hear from you until after our election is over. The more importance we attach to hostages, the more likely they are to be taken. In this year, I don't really see which way the release of one or two hostages would cut, whether it would particularly benefit anybody.
Well, let me ask you both to comment on what our allies have done in Europe. The French dealt with the Iranians and improved diplomatic relations. Some say even in some way paid some ransom. Now the British are doing, taking steps to improve relations, and there's word that their hostages are going to come out. Let me play devil's advocate and ask you, what's so wrong with that? Why not?
I think what the British are doing seems to me very appropriate. They have strictly separated the hostage question from other negotiations. The French got themselves into a position in which they actually turned over assets to the Iranians, and whatever they are saying, it looked as if they were paying ransom, and I don't think that's a healthy situation.
Leslie, I must say I don't agree with Dr. Kissinger on the 6-week interval. I think you have to keep pressing for the return of the hostages every day. I think that any notion that we would somehow not welcome them back during an election period is something that simply is not consistent with our desires to have them back whenever.
No, I'm not saying we wouldn't welcome them back. I'm saying we won't negotiate about them. They will release the hostages for their own purposes, as they took them for their own purposes. And of course they would always be welcomed, and of course it would always be noticed, and of course it would help relationship between the two countries. But they should not be able to inflict the indignity on us of making it look as if we were turning the return of Americans into a domestic political issue. Of course we take them back, eagerly.
Warren Christopher?
Of course we'd take them back, and I agree with you, Henry, that the highest priority has to be given to making no concessions against the background of the Iran-Contra scandal. I think the United States will have a hard time rebuilding its credibility, that we don't make concessions. It may take some time for us to do that, and we have to stress that day in and day out.
Warren Christopher, are you advocating that we not even talk to the Iranians until Khomeini has passed from the scene and a new regime takes over?
No, I think we ought to talk with them. We shouldn't make concessions. We shouldn't pay ransom. I think we ought to be available to talk to them. I just don't have very high hopes. I wouldn't go way out of my way to try to court them. They're far too manipulative for us to deal with in this period.
I'd like to say one thing about the Iran-Contra thing. I think it has turned out that the assessment that President Reagan made, that there were elements in the Iranian government that were moving in a less aggressive direction, turned out to be correct. The implementation of that conviction became too exuberant and got into the wrong hands. But in fairness, one has to point out that the analysis turned out to be correct, and that the conditions that now exist on Iran, Iraq reflect, and also maybe on the hostages, reflect that the analysis was correct.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, Henry Kissinger in Connecticut and Warren Christopher in Los Angeles. When we come back, we'll talk politics with Beckel and Barnes.
I hope there will be other releases. I hope this is not just kind of a teaser, and then we'll see a long period before someone else is set free.
For some perspective, we're going to turn now to former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who is joining us this morning from Martha's Vineyard. Well, first, Mr. Kissinger, let me ask you about the news out of Beijing this morning that the United States Undersecretary of State Peter Tarnoff says that President Clinton now wants to meet with the Chinese president. Is that good news, bad news? How do you evaluate that?
I welcome that news. I believe that Sino-American relations are in need of a high-level review so that both sides can decide in which direction to go, where they can cooperate, and where they may have to disagree. And I believe that a meeting between President Clinton and the Chinese president will be a very important step in that direction.
What kind of meeting should it be, Dr. Kissinger? I would guess the Chinese would like to have a full-scale state visit at the White House so they can say that this administration did more for them than the visiting president from Taiwan. Should it go that far, or should it just be a meeting?
Well, I don't think the purpose of the meeting is to make a distinction. I think depending on what the preparations will show, a working visit perhaps to the White House with some social event thrown in would probably be an appropriate measure, provided that the preparations show that there is some progress on issues that concern us.
Dr. Kissinger, you have said that relations with China are on a collision course. You have told this to the president in a private meeting. You've today said there should be a high-level review. If you were still sitting in the White House today, what would you be doing differently from this president and his team?
Well, first of all, I believe that the steps that have been taken by the administration in the last few weeks, I support. The problem has been that in the earlier period, there has been a tendency to set up a checklist of American preferences and to treat the Chinese as if they were passing some sort of examination in how they were performing on our set of priorities on their domestic, mostly on issues that they consider within their domestic jurisdiction. What really is of concern, should be of concern to both of our countries is this. Japan is undergoing a transformation. Korea has major changes. India is emerging. Southeast Asia is growing. Russia is developing new positions in Asia. How do the United States and China view their positions in relation to all these tendencies? And my view is that for both of us, it is better if we are perceived to be in close consultation than if every other country can count on our adversarial relationship. So we, for once, ought to talk about strategic and geopolitical issues and not simply on the agenda that has been the case up to now.
Dr. Kissinger, is China a nuclear threat, and should we begin to think of China as having the potential to be the Soviet Union of the 90s? I know, when was it, a couple of weeks ago, they fired these short-range missiles, which clearly demonstrated, and clearly their intent was to show that they have missiles that can reach Tokyo or could reach Taiwan. Do they at this point pose a nuclear threat to the United States, or will they in the future?
At this moment, they do not pose a nuclear threat to the United States, and for the next 25 years, I don't foresee that they will develop even a fraction of the nuclear capability that, for example, Russia has, and we don't consider Russia a nuclear threat anymore. So the key is whether we can develop a political relationship with China that emphasizes the common interests we have. And I am very worried that as the senators, that we are talking ourselves into a state of mind in which we are trying to repeat in Asia some of the experiences of Europe. But in Asia, there would be no takers. There's no NATO possible in Asia against China, and there's no need for it.
Dr.
For the next 10 years at least, I do not foresee that there's any military confrontation necessary or conceivable.
Dr. Kissinger, have you tried to rein in your fellow Republicans in this regard? Because the Republican-dominated Congress feels much, much differently about China. In fact, if anything, the Congress is moving towards a two-China policy, and your protege, Newt Gingrich, on this very show suggested that Taiwan be independent.
Newt Gingrich is not my protege. He's a friend whom I respect. And I pointed out to him that I disagreed with him, and I think he has modified his position since then. I believe relations with China are so important, they cannot be made a partisan issue, and they should not be made a partisan issue. Both parties have supported good relations with China since the 70s, and insofar as I have any influence, my views are known, and I do not believe that it is right to make China a partisan issue.
So, okay, Dr. Kissinger, so you've said the administration has made mistakes, the Congress has made mistakes. What about the Chinese themselves? They're not riding on the white horse off into the sunset these days. We don't even have ambassadors in each capital because of the Chinese.
Well, I believe that the issue of the ambassadors is going to be settled very quickly now that the principle of a meeting between the two presidents has been established. Because it wouldn't be natural not to have ambassadors. I'm not saying the Chinese are right in all respects. I myself intervened with the Chinese on the Harry Wu case on a number of occasions and at very high levels. There are many aspects of Chinese domestic practices that I don't approve of, and we have, and the United States has certain convictions which it will express. We have, however, to bring this into relationship to the overriding issue of peace in Asia, stability in the world, in which I believe we can cooperate with China on many and most of the key issues. And this is what ought to be fostered. We should not abandon the principles on which our society is founded.
Dr. Kissinger, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us this morning with that analysis. We'll be back in just a minute with a final word.